The first phase of the US President Donald Trump's Middle East peace plan has been officially launched in Bahrain. Representing Trump at the workshop in Bahrain, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, he said the agreement on economic pathway is a precondition for Middle East peace.
My direct message to the Palestinian people is that despite what those who have let you down in the past tell you, President Trump and America have not given up on you. The vision we developed and released, if executed correctly, will lead to a better future for the Palestinian people, a future of dignity, prosperity, and opportunity.
Jared Kushner speaking earlier in Bahrain. We were joined for analysis by our correspondent from Jerusalem, Iris Makler.
They say that the order's wrong, that really if you have a peace plan, it should start with peace. It shouldn't start with an economic plan and then work backwards. They want the rights figured out. And it's a persuasive argument because this workshop is actually called Peace to Prosperity, and they say that's the right order. No one really is going to be attracted to investing in a war zone, is their point. They want to make their own decisions about their future. It's a political issue. And I've interviewed businessmen who support the leadership in Ramallah. They say, our problem is that we don't control our destiny as businessmen or as Palestinians. Fix that, and then we'll talk about the money. So that's part of it. There is also the poor relationship between Washington and Ramallah, possibly the worst it's been in decades. There really is deep mistrust between the two sides, and I think that's why Jared Kushner is reaching out over the heads of the Palestinian leadership to the Palestinian people and making these promises, promising them $50 billion, promising them 1 million jobs to try and get them on board on what he's calling the opportunity of the century.
Iris Makler, who joined us a little earlier. Well, on this same issue, the Bahrain conference, or to give it its proper working name, the Workshop for Peace and Prosperity, was boycotted by the Palestinians. As it was taking place in Bahrain, this was a scene in the Palestinian territories, large demonstrations on the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank. The Palestinians say the Trump plan, which is touting $50 billion in investment, is an economy-first approach doomed to fail.
These shops in Gaza are closed, as are government offices and universities. Palestinians are on a general strike to protest against the US-led two-day workshop in Bahrain with Arab ministers aimed at boosting Palestinian economic growth.
We don't need money. We're not hungry for bread. We're hungry for dignity. Give us our dignity and freedom, not money.
The goal of the Bahrain conference is to drum up $50 billion of investment over 10 years for Palestinians. The US mission is led by Donald Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner. Palestinians say, however, that what matters is securing a political agreement first. Protesters in Jericho in the West Bank burnt an empty casket with the words saying, "The deal of the century born dead." Looking on, Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat, who says the proposals discussed in Bahrain represent Israeli interests, they will not work.
This team is not balanced at all. This team is trying to dictate the program of the Settlers Council. And it's a total failure. I would not give this paper a D.
The political part of the US plan will only likely be presented after the Israeli election in the autumn. The Palestinians have rejected US mediation since Donald Trump's move at the end of 2017 to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Next here on France 24, Iran says it will further free itself from the 2015 nuclear deal in defiance of new American sanctions. This comes as the US President Donald Trump warned Iran of overwhelming retaliation for any attacks. And all this follows the wake of the shooting down of a US surveillance drone by the Iranians and the attack on 2 oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz.
After Iran's president slammed new US sanctions as outrageous and idiotic, a top security official announced that next month the country plans to abandon further commitments under the landmark nuclear deal of 2015. Iran has already begun ramping up uranium enrichment and is on track to break one of the pact's key limits on Thursday. a course of action that drew criticism from France's foreign minister.
A violation from Iran would be a serious mistake and a bad response to the pressure exerted by the United States. French, German and British diplomacy is fully mobilized to make Iran understand that this would not be in its interest.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump fired off a saber-rattling tweet in response to Tehran's criticism.
Iran's very ignorant and insulting statement put out today only shows that they do not understand reality. Any attack by Iran on anything American will be met with great and overwhelming force. In some areas, overwhelming will mean obliteration.
Britain's foreign secretary also urged restraint.
Neither side wants war in this situation, but it's very important that there are ladders for people to climb down so that discussions and negotiations can take place.
Tensions between the U.S. and Iran have been at a fever pitch since last week. Washington accuses Iran of shooting down one of its drones over international waters. Tehran maintains the drone was flying over its own airspace.
So what is Donald Trump's endgame in the Middle East? The U.S. president delighting Israel and Gulf allies by ordering fresh sanctions against Iran's leadership. What's inspired that maximum pressure policy? The one that's forced the rest of the world to sever trade with Tehran and led to last week's spike in tension near the Strait of Hormuz, the passageway for 1/3 of the planet's seabound oil shipments. Exhibit B this Tuesday, a donor conference in Bahrain that promises a public-private partnership to develop the Palestinian territories. An economy-first approach long espoused by the current right-wing leadership in Israel, left out is any whiff of compromise on a political solution, hence the boycott of the Bahrain workshop by the Palestinians themselves. That conference timed to rival one for donors by the UN's Refugee Agency for Palestinians, which the Trump administration has quit. Coincidence? We'll ask our panel. With the Palestinians' biggest donor, Europe, sidelined and the UN under fire. What a response to the Trump way of handling the Middle East. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Donald Trump's Middle East endgame. With us, Kiara Ayad, researcher at the Arab Reform Initiative. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
From Boston, John Hajar, co-director of the American Mideast Coalition for Democracy. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
From London, Esfandiar Batman Galij, founder of Bourse and Bazaar. Tell us what Bourse and Bazaar is.
We track developments in Iran's economy, and it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, welcome to the show. Welcome as well from Giethoorn in the Netherlands, Middle East consultant Leo Quarton.
Hi there, good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The Trump administration bills the plan as, quote, peace to prosperity. It's being rolled out over 2 days in Bahrain, a public-private $50 billion investment formula to first develop the West Bank and Gaza before broaching a political solution. With the Palestinians boycotting and the Trump administration asking Israel to stay away, the president's Mideast peace envoy, who's also his son-in-law, nonetheless upbeat at the outset.
For a moment, imagine a new reality in the Middle East. Imagine a bustling commercial and tourist center in Gaza and the West Bank where international businesses come together and thrive. Imagine the West Bank as a blossoming economy full of entrepreneurs, engineers, scientists, and business leaders. Imagine people and goods flowing quickly and securely throughout the region as economics become more integrated and people become more prosperous.
Kiara Ayad, as a Palestinian, what do you think of when you hear those words?
So honestly, it seems that the Americans are presenting a delusional and unrealistic understanding of the dynamics of the conflict by presenting the economic part before the political part. What Jared Kushner was referring to, this imaginary Palestinian territory, is in fact that is of course experiencing all of this economic prosperity and development and investments is in fact a step towards the liquidation of Palestinian rights and of the Palestinian national aspirations. And what the American administration doesn't realize is the intrinsic and inseparable link between the economic challenges that are addressed in the vision, which will be discussed in Bahrain, in the US's economic vision, and the political challenges. The fact that the Palestinian economy is in the dire situation it is in today because of limitations and restrictions imposed by the Israeli occupation. It is the fact that Israel restricts access to half of agricultural and grazable land in the West Bank and Gaza for Palestinian producers, the fact that they are controlling that Israel controls 60% of West Bank territory, which is considered to be the most fertile and breadbasket of Palestine, the fact that customs are controlled by Israel, telecommunication frequencies, everything in Palestine is heavily restricted and controlled by Israel. So if you do not address the political problems, then you will not be able to find economic solutions or mobilize political will for that.
It's been more than a quarter century since the Oslo Accords. The peace process is moribund. Kushner is saying, why not try something new, a different approach?
It depends on the approach first of all, it depends on the approach, of course, as I said, and their approach is nothing new. If you look at, for example, the content presented in the vision, it's all based on USAID development projects. Even some of the ideas, a lot of experts have pointed out, have been reused from previous political agreements or proposals, such as the possibility of establishing a transportation route between the West Bank and Gaza. So this is nothing new. This is really all just make-believe in order to buy time because there is no real political will from the Palestinian side to engage with them while occupation continues and while Palestinians experience more suffering and employment goes up.
John Najjar, do you agree?
No, I don't. I think it is a novel approach. I think it's a good approach. Palestinians are very smart and hardworking people. They've succeeded wildly in wherever they've emigrated to. And I think that the Palestinians have a crisis of leadership, as they've had for many years. Look, you have a hardcore Islamist regime, Hamas in the Gaza, and a Islamist light regime in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority that pays the families of murderers. They go and murder innocent civilians. I don't think the Palestinian people are well served by these leaders. I think the Palestinian people, if given the space, but don't you given some incentives,
don't you agree
will
that
wildly in their land?
Don't you agree, though, with Chiara that Israel holds all the levers when it comes to the Palestinian economy, and so it makes no sense to first start with the economy? You have to begin with the politics.
I think that the Israelis have to, they live in a democratic country, and they ultimately have to answer to the electorate. I think the Israeli population, including many Israeli Arabs, want to live in peace with their neighbors. And I think that the Palestinian leadership is living 30, 40 years in the past and still clinging to, driving, some of them still cling to the hope of driving the Jews into the sea. Let's face it. They don't hide it. Hamas states it openly. So I think it's time to turn the page. It's time for a new chapter. The Palestinians need younger leadership, not an 83-year-old leader. They need to do away with their Islamist leaders. They need popularly elected, representative, young generation of leaders that will sit down and make the tough decisions to work on living peacefully. And then they will enjoy tremendous benefits, tremendous dividends from that. And Donald Trump, being a businessman, understands that sometimes you need economic incentives. And hopefully the money would not be squandered by corrupt politicians as it was by Yasser Arafat and all of his successors and predecessors that supposedly led the Palestinian people. They led them down a dark alley that's brought them nothing but misery. And proof of that is, look at the Palestinians' conditions, you know, in their land versus where they've in the lands of emigration where they've succeeded. That's all the proof you need.
Very briefly, Chiara.
So I actually would like to an extent, agree with the speaker. I don't think there's a disagreement that there is a crisis of legitimacy in the Palestinian in the Palestinian leadership, or a lack of vertical trust between the Palestinian population and its representatives. However, after all, there were democratic and transparent elections in 2006, and Hamas was democratically elected, and it was in fact the international community that wanted Fatah to stay in power and has continued to do so. So it's foreign intervention that has led to this crisis of leadership and crisis of representation in Palestine.
Leo Korten, with the Palestinians boycotting, with the Israelis asked to stay away, what's the point of this, what's billed as a workshop, this Bahrain workshop?
Well, actually, I see it as a kind of window dressing. Because if you see, for example, the press in especially the Arab Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, over the last few years, see quite some opinionated articles appearing saying, why should we wait for the Palestinians to make peace with Israel? Because the main threat for our countries is Iran. It's not Israel anymore. Times have changed. Only the Palestinians cannot come to grips with reality. They cannot close ranks. I mean, there's still this rift between Gaza and the West Bank. And I see actually this conference or this workshop in Bahrain as a kind of way of saying to the Palestinians, look, we put a plan on the table, accept it or not. Well, the Palestinians clearly have not accepted it. And the next step will be actually for some countries to say, all right, Palestinians, we gave you a chance to jump on the bandwagon. You didn't do it. So we are free actually to move on and have closer relationships with Israel, because in the end, I think that's where the real interest is, especially with the Gulf states attending now in Bahrain.
You agree with that, Esfandiar Batman-Gelij, that it's actually more about normalizing relations between those Gulf states and Israel than it is about the Palestinians?
Well, I think the case of the Middle East peace process that Kushner is pushing forward is a really interesting way to actually look at kind of the cautionary tale that the Iran deal may show for the Palestinians. Because one of the concerns here is that to the extent that regional actors are setting the agenda for what the Palestinians should agree to as a prudent way forward, they might end up in a situation where, like Iran, they came to the table, negotiated on a deal, but were not given the second part of what they were looking for. And what I mean by that is that to the extent that Kushner has basically promised an economic package before a political solution, in some ways the lesson of the Iran deal is that the United States offered a political solution but didn't follow through on the economic package. And I think the Trump administration basically is carrying out two plans in the Middle East, and each plan is an indictment of the other.
How, each one's an indictment of the other?
In basically showing that to the same way that Kushner is offering economic incentives without a political solution, Mike Pompeo is basically saying to Iran, you need to come to the table. We need a political solution before we offer you any kind of economic inducements. And, you know, the Trump administration is pushing forward its policy of maximum pressure sanctions. And I think it shows a lack of understanding about, and I'll pick up on what John mentioned, the electoral component here. For example, in Iran, you have a population that gave their government a strong electoral mandate to fix the economy by coming to a political agreement with the international community. They came to that agreement, but then were not able to see the economic dividends that the Iranian people think they deserved. And I suppose that there will be skepticism on the part of Palestinians about entering into some sort of economic framework without that political solution, not least because it's not clear to me how international investors are going to move into a country and invest their capital when there isn't clarity about who actually is in charge of territory and the laws that govern.
All right, and then there's this question of whether or not there's a coincidence of the calendar. At the same time, this Tuesday, UN headquarters in New York, a pledging conference to raise $1.2 billion for the UN Palestinian Agency. Its head regrets the scheduling of that rival conference, the workshop in Bahrain, and the U.S. decision last year to defund emergency relief for the Palestinians.
We have to ensure that food assistance continues to 1 million people, not in 2 years, but today and tomorrow. We have to ensure that Palestine refugee students, boys and girls, can go back to their schools, not in a few years' time, but at the end of August and September. So I think the timelines that we're talking about and the focus that UNRWA has is on delivering on its mandate immediately. It's a continued effort.
Leo Korten, the fact that there's this other pledging conference going on for a UN organization that the United States has quit, is that a coincidence?
I don't know. Actually, it is also not a coincidence. Actually, or maybe it is that at the same time this conference is, which has been in the planning for 2 years. Now the Americans are building up pressure towards Iran. I mean, it all seems to be interrelated, or it is all a coincidence. Personally, I cannot answer that question. It all comes together, and we have to come to grips with this reality.
Come to grips with the reality, and your thoughts on the UN Refugee Agency and its future now. They were able to make up the loss of the money that they haven't gotten from the United States for this year. But what are your thoughts on the fact that the US has defunded it?
It's extremely serious, of course. I mean, the United States have been for many, many years the honest broker in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And they always actually funded the Palestinians through the UN. And it was very important to keep the Palestinians on board. Now, what we've seen in the last year, or last two years actually, the recognition by the US of Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, the acceptance of the annexation of the Golan Heights, the utterances actually of the U.S. ambassador in Israel about annexing parts of the West Bank. It's all a very much pro-Israel stance from the side of the U.S. When it comes actually to giving money to the Palestinians through the UN to sustain their lives, to give some future, and then stopping it. It's a bias. It's a very pro-Israel bias on the side of the U.S. and they're spoiling actually many years when the U.S. was trying, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to bring about peace in the Palestinian areas and between the Palestinians and Israel. And somehow actually they're spoiling this position.
Yeah, Leo Korten talking about how it's all interrelated. We're going to be talking about the spike in tension between the U.S. and Iran. When we come back, you're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And we're looking at the Middle East plan for Donald Trump. On the one hand, there's that pledging conference in Bahrain we've been talking about. On the other, that spike in tension with Iran. With us is Kiara Ayad, researcher at the Arab Reform Initiative. Welcome back as well to John Hajar in Boston, co-director of the American Mideast Coalition for Democracy. Esfandiar Batman Galij, the founder of the consultants Bourse and Bazaar. Consultants, or would you say, how would you describe it?
We're more of a media company. We do publishing, research, and events.
There you go. From Giethoorn in the Netherlands, Leo Korten is with us, Middle East. He is a consultant, Middle East consultant, also a university lecturer. Welcome back to the show. We were talking before the break how the Trump administration has taken aim at the UN Refugee Agency that handles the immediate needs in the Palestinian territories. One of the people who works with Jared Kushner on Middle East policy has called for its disbanding, that UN organization. And the European Union, should be said, by far the biggest funder of the Palestinian territories. The EU, which is struggling for its part to also stick to the Iran nuclear deal. and trade with Tehran. What's with U.S. sanctions forbidding any dollar transactions. On that score, Donald Trump over the weekend spoke to NBC's Meet the Press program.
They have violated the agreement because I think in the areas that we're not allowed to inspect, they're doing things, and I think they have been for years.
Europeans don't think they're violating the agreement.
I don't care about the Europeans. The Europeans are going out and making a lot of money. The Europeans are fine, but they're going out and making a lot of money. They're selling in France, they're selling cars to Iran, they're doing other things. And let me tell you, we're very good to Europe. We take care of them. NATO, we spend a tremendous amount of disproportionate amount on trade. The European Union's taken, they have really taken advantage of us for a long time. Just to finish, we have great relationships with Europe. I don't mind Europe getting in the middle. Europe wants to make a deal too. Europe would love to see a deal be made.
John Ajar, do you agree with Donald Trump when he says, I don't care about the Europeans?
Well, you know, President Trump has a way of speaking sometimes a bit crudely, but I do agree that, listen, he was elected to represent American interests. He's a populist, and I think he's also looking at the popular interests of the people on the ground. Look at the European companies that have been dealing with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They have benefited and profited wildly because of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And under his predecessor, President Obama, $150 billion was shipped to the mullahs. What do the people have to show for it? What improvements have there been on the ground? What improvements have there been to the Palestinians living in camps who was receiving billions and billions of dollars over decades from the UN Relief Works Agency? Nothing. And Donald Trump was elected to upend this whole corrupt system and to change the facts on the ground. He did it by recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He's doing it by trying to start a whole new chapter in trying to reach a solution with the Palestinian people, and also trying to send a message to the people of Iran that the U.S. stands with them, not with the mullahs, with the people on the ground. And that's the message that Donald Trump is sending, and also trying to change the behavior of the IRI and the Revolutionary Guards, that we see what they're doing, we're sanctioning them now, and we're sending a message also to the Europeans. You have to choose. Do you want to continue in a mercantilist fashion, doing business with the IRI and the Revolutionary Guards and making money, or are you going to stand with the people that defend you, the Americans and NATO, who ultimately are protecting you from threats of terrorism and jihadism?
Leo Quarton, as a European, what do you say?
Oh, I don't agree, of course. I mean, it's just, trade is seen in Europe as an instrument to rein in Iran. I mean, in the end, Europe and America just want to do the same thing. We want to rein in Iran. We see that Iran is spreading its influence throughout the Middle East, that it's causing tensions, and we want to do something about it. So we want to get on speaking terms with the Iranians. But in Europe, no, we don't send actually warships to the Persian Gulf. We don't do that. We do it actually in a much more gentle way. We just want to build trade relations with the Iranians to get them on board, to do investment. Yes, we will make some money out of it. But on the other hand, actually, we also see it as a kind of engagement of Iran. And we also see that Iran, I was in Iran actually a few months ago, that the Iranian economy is really in dire straits, and they need investment from the West, from any country actually, because the young Iranians need jobs, they need a life, they need a salary, they need a future, and this is actually how Europe is looking at this. We in Europe, we don't think at all that sending warships to Iran and putting pressure on the Iranians will ever bring a good thing about. Not at all. Not at all.
Well, what did it do prior to President Trump's election? What did engagement by President Obama and the Europeans do to temper the Islamic Republic of Iran, the leadership? I'm talking, not the Iranian people. The Iranian people are very moderate. What did it do to change or temper their behavior in any way? They were yelling death to Iran and Tehran prior to the JCPOA, after the JCPOA, and after the election of President Trump. It has not tempered their behavior in one way. They've solidified their hold over Iran, over Lebanon. They're creating trouble all throughout the Gulf. They've frightened the heck out of all our Gulf allies, the UAE, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. They have spread their tentacles worldwide. They're dealing in drugs and in contraband in Latin America. They're infiltrating the southern border of America. None of this was
the
stopped
southern
by
border of
the
America?
JCPOA, and it's gotten worse. Yes.
How are they infiltrating the southern border of America?
They've worked with jihadist groups to infiltrate the southern border of America.
Okay. Esfandiar Batman Gilic.
May I actually add just one?
Sorry, go ahead. First Leo, and then Esfandar.
Yeah. I just want to add just one positive thing, actually, the JCPOA brought about, and that's the defeat of Islamic State, of Daesh in Iraq. I mean, for a short period, in Mosul, in Tikrit, and all these cities actually in the middle of Iraq, which were in the hands of Daesh, actually the Americans cooperated tacitly with the Iranians and the Shia militias in Iraq to rein in and to defeat Daesh. And we succeeded together. It's a splendid thing. We made the world a safer place.
I disagree. I think that was the work of the Syrian Democratic Forces that along with the mandate from President Trump to go in and crush Daesh that caused it. The Iranians play both sides. Ultimately,
right. Let me bring in Esfandiar Batman Gilic on this. Esfandiar.
Yeah, let me jump in. There's one thing that John said that I agree with, which is that the Iranian people are basically looking for moderation, and we know that they're looking for better economic opportunities. But we have to remember what exactly the last few years have shown the Iranian people. If you go back to 2013, the Iranian people overwhelmingly elected Rouhani as their president with a specific mandate, not only to go out into the international community and address some of the security concerns of the region and the world powers by coming up with a nuclear deal, but also, and this is often forgotten, to embark on a significant campaign of domestic economic reform, largely about rooting out corruption and limiting the role of the IRGC in the economy. That is a multi-year project. And he and his administration pushed that project forward because it was the basis of their electoral support. But we arrive at the Trump administration and we arrive at basically their rejection of the JCPOA. And now we're in a situation that the Iranian people, despite the compliance of their government with the nuclear deal, are being denied the economic benefits of that agreement. Sanctions relief never manifested the way it was supposed to. And the lesson is ultimately that even if the people are moderate, even if they use their institutions to elect governments genuinely interested in economic development, there remain impediments in the international community because of this notion that Iran is a malign actor. And my concern is that the allergic reaction we have to economic engagement of Iran, which is funny because we're talking about economic engagement with Palestine as though it's the solution to all problems, is going to continue to be the barrier to the United States properly accounting for how to deal with the security dilemma and the regional anxieties presented by the Iran nuclear file.
Yeah, those regional anxieties which have spiked in the last couple of weeks. Iran, which this Monday squeezed tighter by new sanctions. There are more coming on Thursday. Nicholas Rushworth has that story.
Diplomacy is over permanently between Iran and the United States as far as Tehran is concerned. The Iranian president, Hassan Rouhani, poured scorn on new Trump sanctions and on the US president himself.
US leaders are suffering from mental disability. The White House is afflicted by mental retardation and does not know what to do.
The United States issued new sanctions accusing Iran of shooting down one of its drones over international waters. Tehran published GPS coordinates showing the drone was flying over its airspace. The Trump administration said financial sanctions had been on the cards before the incident, a way to try and get Iran back to the negotiating table. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, speaking in Israel, says the White House remains open to talks.
The president has held the door open to real negotiations. to completely and verifiably eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons program, its pursuit of ballistic missile delivery systems, its support for international terrorism, and its other malign behavior worldwide. All that Iran needs to do is to walk through that open door.
Tehran says sanctions on Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, are futile, as he only has a house and a place of worship. The Trump administration is also blacklisting 8 commanders in the Iranian Navy and the Revolutionary Guards, as well as Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Tensions are escalating as U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tours the Middle East to try and build support against what it calls a military threat from Iran.
So we had Kiara Ayad, remember last Thursday news that this unmanned drone had been shot down in disputed territory between Iran and international waters. And then the word on Friday that there'd been this aborted raid on the Iranians. What's your thoughts when you look at this report?
So, of course, I am no Iran expert, but I think it's really interesting, based on the conversation we have had, to look at the similarities between the potential new Iranian negotiations and the Palestinian negotiations that the U.S. administration is trying to push for. In fact, what the U.S. administration has done by following this policy and deviating from Obama's administration's policies and the JCPOA is that it has broken the trust between the Iranian government and the U.S. administration. So I think that the measures need to be re-established. Either the Europeans must intervene to re-establish trust between the parties.
We've had on this point last week the Iranians setting this 10-day deadline by which they'll enrich uranium above a certain point. This Tuesday at the French National Assembly, the French foreign minister saying an Iranian violation would be a serious mistake and a bad response to the pressure exerted by the United States. Those are the kind of remarks you want to be hearing from Europeans.
Certainly not, but of course, if the Iranians are enriching uranium to a level that will enable them to develop nuclear weapons, is of course a threat to international security, a threat to Europe and globally. However, it can be argued that the Americans have pushed them to that limit because the IAEA had affirmed that the Iranians had respected the enrichment levels during the JCPOA. They, in fact, had been complying. And of course, it's ironic because the U.S. isn't taking a similar position vis-a-vis the development of nuclear weapons towards Israel. Israel has more than 200 nuclear warheads and does not allow IAEA inspectors to inspect the premises. So these are clear double standards that are in the international community.
Esfandiar Batman Galej, your thoughts on how Europe should be handling this spike in tension?
So for the last year, Iranian hopes had been that Europe could be the power to step in and really save the nuclear deal on 2 fronts. First, that they could help compensate some of the damage that's been dealt economically from Trump's reimposition of sanctions. And second, that they could step in and try and convince Trump that the maximum pressure policy is not leading anywhere and that actually there's a different way of doing things, perhaps getting a nice deal that he could put his name on. Unfortunately, it would seem that they failed on both counts, I think largely because of a lack of confidence in Europe that they really can play that role, and a little bit too much faith that the United States was willing to restrain itself at each step at which they increased the maximum pressure campaign. And now the European efforts, which largely amount to this trade mechanism established by France, Germany, and the UK, a state-owned company called ENDGAME, may be a little bit too late to make a meaningful difference for
just
Iran.
explain this
and
trade
Iran
mechanism.
Has said that it's resolutely going to push forward.
Just explain this trade mechanism would be an idea to do trading that's not in U.S. dollars, but none of the small companies or big ones feel comfortable doing it.
it's actually a little bit more constrained than that. There's a number of European companies that still trade with Iran, largely in categories that you would consider humanitarian, like food and pharmaceuticals. The challenge that they have is, at the moment, there are probably fewer than 10 banks in Europe that are willing to accept a cross-border financial transaction originating from Iran. This is because of the all-encompassing nature of the US sanctions and a perception of risk about the Iranian financial system. So if you're one of those companies that's trying to do this trade, it's incredibly expensive and difficult, even if you're trying to sell something as simple and benign as medicine. The role of this company, established by the E3 countries, was to provide an opportunity to do trade without a cross-border financial transaction by providing a netting mechanism. In short, a European exporter to Iran would get paid by a European importer from Iran. So funds would remain in Europe and funds would remain in Iran and would be coordinated via payment instructions sent from this company. And it is a feasible model, but the problem is that it's the one concrete thing that the Europeans have come up with in all this time. It's not going to make a meaningful difference in counteracting the full scope of economic hardship, even if it's a strong political signal. And unfortunately, the Iranians seem to have become impatient with its operationalization.
And when you hear Donald Trump saying that the Europeans have been taking advantage of the United States?
Well, can I comment on that?
I mean,
when Trump was elected president, there was, I don't know if any European power, any European NATO member were paying the 2% of their GDP towards NATO, as called for, by all the countries of NATO. And Donald Trump challenged them on that, and now I believe a lot are. I can't tell you exactly how many. But all the comments that have been made, the premise is that there's legitimacy in the government in Iran. The people of Iran have rejected the legitimacy of their own government. They're marching in the streets daily and dying in the streets. There's no legitimacy. And the JCPOA did nothing to moderate their behavior one bit. Kira mentioned the IAEA. Well, if you dig deep enough, you find out that they actually were not allowed on many sites, and that the regime continued to develop ballistic missiles before and after the JCPOA. They have lost legitimacy in the eyes of their people, in the eyes of all their neighbors, as have the Palestinian leadership. That's another story.
If I can jump in here.
But related and very analogous.
If I can jump in here.
Esfandiari Batman-Gilic.
Yeah, I think there's a common theme that we need to pull out, both on the conversation of the Palestinians and of the Iranians. It's that, unfortunately, the West, or the international community, is really unsophisticated at listening to the people of Palestine and Iran, understanding what their political goals are, understanding how they define the question of legitimacy in the governments that control ultimately so much about their state-society relations.
And the Iranian Americans that I speak with, the leaders of the Iranian American community are overwhelmingly in favor of Donald Trump's policies in the Middle East, because they are talking to their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, their aunts and uncles in Iran, and they're telling them, we want to be done with 40 years of jihadist and Sharia-based law and the Khomeinist regime. They're tired of it. They want to go back. They have a proud history.
John, let me tell you,
one at a time.
As an Iranian American,
allow
me, as an Iranian American, I can tell you that that's probably not a fair characterization of the feelings of the Iranian American community. I'm sure that you've had conversations that lead you to believe that. But there are 80 million people in Iran, and they have their own hopes and aspirations, and they had wanted this to turn out differently. And unfortunately, the U.S. administration, for whatever its political goals and whatever its security concerns, let those people down.
All right, Trump's, what we talking about, a transaction?
That's not true. In 2009, they marched in the streets and they said, Obama, are you with us? And Obama, that plea fell on deaf ears. People died in the streets then, and in the last year or so.
So John, let me ask you the question then.
People are dying in the streets again.
John, let me ask you the question then. Is the ultimate aim of this maximum pressure to bring, as Donald Trump says, the Iranian leadership to the table for an eventual deal? And he says the deal is specifically to be so that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. or is the aim regime change?
The former, but I'm sure if the latter occurred, that would result in a much more peaceful Middle East, and I think it would be a much more prosperous future for the people of Iran. And I think that obviously, I think countries around the world.
So
would be
the former, but you
outcome.
prefer the
that's
latter.
Not the stated. That's not the stated intent of the administration's policy. They want to bring about change in their behavior and an end to their missile and nuclear programs.
Leo Quarton, your thoughts?
Excuse me?
Your thoughts on this, on what is the ultimate aim of this maximum pressure campaign?
Well, this is the point. I don't know, because it's not clear what the real objective is. On the one hand, you should say, all right, all the things actually the Americans are saying, although they remain very vague. I mean, no malign behavior by the Iranians in the region, and ballistic missiles, and it's quite strange, because up to now, actually, the commitment of Iran towards the atomic agency was good. I mean, they have a good record. So I don't see a problem there. But of course, when you see that people like Pompeo and Bolton are attending rallies and gatherings actually of the opposition, Iranian opposition abroad, especially the Mujahideen Khalq in the US, actually, and those are clearly people who want to bring about regime change. Of course, people in Iran get second thoughts. They think, all right, when the American leaders are attending those meetings, what do they really want? Of course, they want regime change.
All right, Trump transaction when it comes to, as well, to the Strait of Hormuz, taking aim not just at the Americans. Last Thursday, there was, of course, the aborting, as we said, of that strike following the downing of an unmanned drone. On Monday, the U.S. president tweeting, China gets 91% of its oil from the Strait, Japan 62%, many other countries likewise. So why are we protecting the shipping lanes for other countries for zero compensation? All these countries should be protecting their own ships. Does that mean, John Ajar, that Donald Trump wants the Chinese and the Japanese to bring warships to the Strait of Hormuz and protect their own vessels?
No, I think he wants everyone to pay their fair share. And right now, the U.S. is the guarantor of safety and security in the Persian Gulf. And I think he just wants our allies to realize that we've paid a heavy price to guarantee that those shipping lanes stay open. But at the same time, he's done a lot to promote our domestic oil and natural gas industry. And we are, in the United States, we are now the largest producer of hydrocarbons in the world.
So you're saying someone else should be patrolling those waters? You maybe don't need it as much.
I don't think he said somebody else, but I think what he's saying is that they should understand that they have interest there as much as we do, and that they just can't always fall back on American might, and they have serious interest. And I may add that the Europeans are playing a very dangerous game, in that they're giving hope to the mullahs in Tehran that they can wait out Trump. If they said, listen, you better start understand the realities, that you can't continue to spread chaos throughout the region and hegemony, as they've taken over Lebanon and they've taken over Iran, and they've created chaos throughout the region. They should understand
let me ask, because we're running short on time.
There's consequences for that.
Esfandiar Batman-Galich, in 30 seconds, how's it all going to play out at the G20 summit this coming Friday?
Well, we know that Macron is going to be speaking to Trump about the regional tensions and about the Iran issue. And I think that the message that the Europeans are going to send is that it's kind of rich for Donald Trump to be complaining about the costs of defending security in the Persian Gulf, when it ultimately has been the recent moves of his administration that have degraded the security environment so significantly. And that's the assessment not just of those of us that support the deal, but of a lot of the regional actors as well. I think it's notable that the UAE has joined a call from the US and the UK for a diplomatic solution to what's about to happen. No one wants a war in the region. It would be too costly. We have to have diplomacy, but the Trump administration has to get serious and realistic about what it takes to to meet Iran at the table, not bring Iran at the table.
Esfandiar Batman-Gelij in London, I want to thank you. I want to thank John Hajar in Boston, Leo Quarton, who has joined us from Giethoorn in the Netherlands. I also want to thank Chiara Ayad. Thank you for being with us here.